Well, we just finished with Holy Masses, Father, and today is an exciting feast day of St. Januarius.
Yes.
The liquefying of the blood. Now, you spent time in Italy.
Yes. Yes,
Did
I
you ever
many
go
years.
to see?
Absolutely.
Oh, tell us about
I
that.
wasn't able to get there on the feast itself, which is usually the day when it always liquefies. But when I was there with a number of other priests, friends of mine, we prayed, we had Mass, and we were able to hold the reliquary that contains it. It's a sealed glass container and with gold around it. And they told us to say certain prayers, and we did, and it liquefied. So we were able to actually see the miracle with our own eyes.
Now, I was reading in one of the books this morning about it. That is it that they have St. Januarius' head there? Is that right? Or no?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Yeah,
it was
because they
so
were
long
explaining
ago.
something about how they turn it back and forth, and it.
Not the head, the
No,
vial, the vial of blood. You know, it's powdered. It's powder, and then they tip it back and forth, which shows that it coats the outside, the inside of the glass. Yeah.
Wow. Well, your homily today was about forgiveness, because of the gospel. And, of course, our work at Opus Bono Sacerdotes with the priests that are experiencing difficulties. We work with thousands of priests. I gave a talk last night to a group, and the whole notion of love and forgiveness came up, and how difficult it is to love and forgive priests.
Well, I think that when I was in the seminary in Rome, they asked us, what is the definition of a priest? Of course, the first person who raised their hand said, Alter Christus. And he shook his head, yes, but I want more than that. The second person, ambassador for Christ. And he shook his head, kind of back and forth, and he said, well, yes, that is true, but I want a definition that will define the priest for you. And then another person raised their hand, a priest is a teacher. And he said, well, I don't think you're going to get it, so take your pencils and write this down. And I never had to write it down because it made perfect sense. And this is what he said. Beyond and above all those things that you just mentioned, the true definition of a priest is he is a sinner chosen from among sinners to help sinners. And that made so much sense to me that I never had to write it down, because it really gave me hope, because I knew myself as a sinner. In fact, as a priest, I don't know if I'm ever more a priest than when I'm hearing confessions, and I never feel more fulfilled and more a priest than after I'm done hearing confessions. The two greatest things that I can do is to confess the Eucharist, most certainly, but also to forgive sins. That is the most wonderful thing we can do. And oftentimes we put so much hope in the person of the priest, in not the person Alter Christus, but the guy, and we're drawn to it because there's a kind of a movement in Christianity to be entertained more than to grow in spirituality. And so people are drawn to a priest because he's charismatic, or because he's got a lot to say, and they got a good choir or orchestra or whatever it might be. That's why mega churches are so popular. But it's really the spirituality. It's really the Alter Christus, the Christ that has to come through, especially when he's preaching. The priest, if he's going to preach, he's got to preach to himself first. And we as faithful have to realize that he is human. If we place him on such a pedestal as a man, then we're disappointed when we find that he has flaws and faults as a human being. All priests are flawed. I mean, let's face it, look at the 12 guys Jesus picked. I mean, not one of them were really, on the ball at the end there. I mean, they couldn't get it. He kept coming back and repeating it, and they just couldn't understand what he was saying until after the resurrection. Then it dawned on them, and then they were fearless in their faith. Well, priests have to grow as well, and we have to have a spirituality, we have to have a prayer life, and we have to realize that we are not God, but we, in our sinfulness and our weakness, are given that wonderful gift to be able to speak not on our merits, because that's, when we have charisms, okay, there are a lot of priests with charisms, but people have to realize that the charism doesn't make the priest holy. I mean, if you got a priest who preaches like the greatest preacher in the world, it doesn't mean that he's holy because he can preach. It means he has a charism. The charisms are not given for the individual's holiness. They're given for the sanctification of the faithful. The one charism that the priest needs if he's going to preach is the gift of love that comes from the Holy Spirit. And that love is defined by Christ crucified. I mean, you take him off the cross, there's no definition there. There's just a symbol. But if you keep him on the cross, you begin to realize the perfect definition of that love. That's what we were talking about at Mass today. That
Right.
the definition of love is what we have to understand as priests, but also as lay people. We have to understand that just as the apostles were flawed, so our priests are going to be flawed. There's no question about that. They're human beings. And when they fail us, we have to realize that, well, instead of criticizing, instead of becoming depressed and down, what we should be doing is we should be praying for them. When did that mandate stop? When we were called to pray for our priests, especially by the saints throughout the history of the church. If you see something wrong that a priest is doing, go up to him, speak to him about it, pray for him if you can't do that. Pray for our priests. We need prayer. We need prayer. What did John Paul the Great call us to? He said, a constant conversion. He wants us to be constantly converted. Every day, if there's one thing every one of us, priests included, can say, is that yesterday, Lord, I did not love you enough. If we can say that and really understand the truth in that statement, then we'll get quite a ways ahead with regard to our spirituality.
Boy, Father, that's amazing. You're right about that. I've never thought about that before. Yesterday, I did not love him enough.
Well, all of us, it's an honest statement. Because can we love him infinitely? No. And if we want to really love him the way he wants to be loved, who's the one person on earth in the history of mankind that loved him in such a way that none of us could equal that love? Mary. Yeah. That's why priests have to be devoted to Mary. Even if they're no longer functioning as priests, they have to keep that spirituality, that love for Mary, because they never cease being priests. I don't care what happens to them. They are still incredibly beneficial to mankind by the very character, the charism of their priesthood inside of them. You may not be able to function externally, but really, that's God's work. It's the interior that prepares the soul for what we're going to say. So priests who give their lives to God, even if they can't function externally, are incredibly valuable in the history of salvation, in the whole scheme of things when it comes to the salvation of mankind. And for them to walk away spiritually from their priesthood, they might not be able to function, and I do understand that. But I will say this, that they will always be a priest. They have that indelible mark on their soul, and that has power before the throne of God. They still can save souls. They still have this greatness within themselves. Most certainly, mistakes, everyone makes them. And so we have to understand that, and we have to forgive them. Every single chance we have to forgive them. And we have to forgive them not only for them, but we have to forgive them for ourselves. Because I'll tell you something, when we're hurt by a priest, or by anybody really, this goes for anybody who's hurt us, the anger that we feel is really an expression of the wound that they've created inside of us. Now, they could change their entire life, but that will never heal that wound, because God gave each one of us the ability to heal the wound. And how does he do that? Well, remember when Peter came up to Jesus and he said, Lord, how often should I forgive? 7 times? He wasn't asking a question. He was giving an answer. He was thinking that he was going to be praised to high heaven. And so he gave an answer. He doubled the law and then added one for good measure. And he thought Jesus was going to just, oh my heavens, Peter, are you kidding? But instead, Jesus kind of played with him a little bit. And he says, Peter, 7 times, Peter? No, not 7 times. In the meantime, Peter's head's getting bigger, and you can hear the apostles in the background saying, how does he come up with this stuff, But then he hits him, and he says, hits him right between the eyes with it, 70 times, 7 times. Now, we know that he didn't mean that we should forgive somebody who whoops you upside the head 70 times, 7 times, because he figured he gave you enough brains to duck by the second time. So he's talking about forgiving over and over and over for the same sin. Because you see, when somebody causes a wound inside of us, we have to heal it. And we do exactly what children do. We keep ripping it open and looking at it, and it hurts more. Well, what we have to do is this. What Jesus said was, every time we were tempted to look at the wound that hurt us, from whoever it was, we have to say this prayer: God, forgive him, and help me to forgive him too. Every time we say that prayer, what we're doing is we're putting a healing ointment over that wound, because we're not ripping it open anymore, and we're allowing it to heal. And I promise you that one day, if you say that prayer, you may have to say it 500 times, 1,000 times, but there's going to come a time that all of a sudden you'll say, God, forgive. Wait a second, it's gone. I'm not angry anymore. And that is how love conquers the evil. Because you see, love is an act of the will. It is not founded in the emotions. Anger is based in the emotions. And we have to conquer that anger and those wounds by willing to forgive them. We may not like them. And that's part of life. God doesn't require us to like our enemies. We'd have to be schizophrenic to do that. So he requires us to love our enemies. And that can easily be done because it's an act of the will. It's an act of the will to love. I mean, you don't have to like people. You know, get out of their way. Stay out of the way. Leave the room. You don't have to like somebody. But loving them, we are required by God's law to love everyone, especially our enemies. And that's the way to do it. That's the way to heal that wound. But don't expect somebody else to heal it for you, because that's your responsibility. Nobody, no amount of money, no restitution, no apology is ever going to heal that wound, because you're the one who has the ability to heal it. Just keep saying that prayer, and that healing will come. I know it will.
Wow. You're right on. And you know, when we think about healing and wounds, we often think about victims or people that have been hurt. In our work, obviously, it's victims that have been hurt by priests.
Mm-hmm.
But also in our work, we find a lot that it's very difficult for priests who either have offended or have been themselves a victim of a false allegation to forgive themselves and others. And the wound is very difficult for them. And I've seen it deteriorate their life and their priesthood.
Yeah, you know, forgiving someone doesn't cut someone slack, okay? You're not making excuses for them. You're not saying, oh, it's okay, okay? When somebody abuses someone else, they have to be held accountable for that. There's no question about that. But by forgiving them, we allow ourselves to heal the wound inside of us. So we forgive them for ourselves, not for them. We do forgive them for them, and that's easy to do. We can do that in a minute. We can do it just by saying it. But to heal those wounds, why give someone who has hurt you once power over you to keep hurting you? And that's what we do when we don't forgive. You know, it doesn't make excuses for the person who hurt you. That's not what you're doing by forgiving them. What you're doing is you're extending the power of God's forgiveness to heal and to make right your inside of you, that wound, that pain that was caused by that wound. And it works. It does. I mean, all of us have experienced that pain. Could be from our families. It could be from anything. Our relatives, our communities, our fellow priests, our parishioners, or our priests themselves. And we're not saying that, well, you get over it and then it'll be fine. No, we're saying you got to heal that wound, and every person who does something that is wrong should be held accountable. There's no question about that. But even the priests, and there are a number of priests that I've met throughout my life that were falsely accused, and we have to take each case as it is, but we also have to teach each other how to forgive. And forgiving may not allow us to forget. I mean, good heavens, that's impossible to a certain extent. Only God forgets after he forgives. I mean, when God forgives you in the sacrament of penance, your sins are completely obliterated and he doesn't even remember them. That's the magnificence of God's forgiveness. But we're human beings, so we're always going to have that inside of us, but it no longer will have power over us if we forgive. And I know many priests who have forgiven who have been falsely accused. And I know many, many people who have been abused by many different people. And once they learned how to forgive, their lives became normal again, because they were not using it as an excuse, or they were not giving it so much power that they couldn't get on with their lives.
Wow. That's wonderful. And I wanted to, during the break, Father and I were talking a little bit about the priests and dryness in their life and the challenges they may face. So, Father, what are the kind of challenges that you face as a priest, and how do you overcome those or deal with those? Or
Well, there are a lot of things. Remember, as a priest is a human being, and we experience the very same things that other people do. We look at the saints, for example. No saint ever became a saint without a temptation, without dryness, without suffering through prayer. And when we are dry, I remember when I was in the seminary, I asked the spiritual director at the seminary, I went to him and I said, I don't know if I love God. I feel nothing. I feel empty. I do all my work. I do my classes. I'm on time to everything. I attend Mass, but I feel nothing. So he said, well, when you pray tonight, he says, ask your guardian angel if it loves God. And I said, well, I know the answer to that, Father. And he said, well, then the second question is the most important. He said, ask him, how does it feel to love God like that? And so I went to prayer, and, of course, I say, well, do you love God? And, of course, yes, with all my being, over and over. And then I thought, okay, how does it feel to love God with your whole being? And I kept, in my head, hearing, what? And I said, how does it feel? I'm trying to find out. I'm trying to imagine what it feels like. Finally, it came to me. I don't have a body. I feel nothing. So that was a revelation to me when I was at seminary. And so I went to my spiritual director, because I'd only been there for maybe 3 months, okay? And I went to my spiritual director, and I said, I can't believe it. I said, my angel feels nothing at all. And he looked at me, and he said, well then, if angelic love isn't good enough for you, what is? And I realized that love did not depend upon the emotions or the feelings. To feel love is good. But St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross refer to God as la grande nada, the great no thing. He's not a thing. You see, for you and I to feel in prayer, God has to work little miracles inside of us. He's got to have our various glands secreting chemicals, which causes feelings. And when we feel something, we mistakenly sometimes think that we're actually feeling the presence of God, but it's not. We're feeling the gifts that He's giving us. He's allowing us to feel that, but that is not God. When we feel nothing, that is when God is giving us purely Himself. And then we have God alone inside of us, see? And so that's one thing that Teresa of Avila taught me through studying her works, is that when you feel nothing, that's when God is the closest to you. Now, as priests, we go through the same thing. We have feelings. Sometimes we feel nothing, even when we're in the midst of prayer. When we're doing our daily lives, sometimes there is not that emotional high. And nobody could live like that. I mean, let's face it, when you see two people who are engaged, they're almost obnoxious. I mean, they're going on and on and on about each other. You just want to say, oh, please stifle, okay? I'm tired of it, But after the honeymoon is over, and then the moon is gone, and the honey goes, and then you got to kind of live your lives normally. And people argue, for example, couples. And I always ask them, did you feel in love when you were arguing? And they say, no, I would have given a must-whip kick. But it doesn't mean you stop loving. So love is not essentially dependent upon how you feel at any given moment. So if you discern or you determine your love by how you're feeling at any given moment, you're going to be sorely mistaken. So what we need to realize is, first of all, that we are not dependent on how we feel to make our prayer something valuable before God and for ourselves. Now, the second thing, especially for a priest, is the idea of the mystery of faith, the mysterium fidei, the very fact that we, through grace, through the sacrifice of Calvary, through the grace of God, we literally leave time and we enter into God's I am. And that enables us to go anywhere we want into the life of Christ. We can go to Him in the stable of Bethlehem. That's why St. Francis did that. He loved the stable. Why? Because he would go there and he would see the Blessed Mother and he would hold the baby Jesus. 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was born in that stable, Mary saw St. Francis there. Jesus felt the warmth of Francis holding him. That's the mystery of faith. When we go to Mass, we're not celebrating the Last Supper. We are at Calvary in the context of the liturgical supper, but we literally transcend the time in which we live, and we are literally mystically transported to Calvary. So 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, he saw me standing next to his mother. He saw you standing next to his mother. That is why you always see Anthony with the child Jesus on a book. Why? Why would they do that? Because he loved to go to the childhood of Jesus, and he would study Jesus as he was with the children, as he was with his foster father Joseph, as he was with his mother in the house, and he would ask Jesus questions, and he would learn from that beautiful moment. Well, Jesus 2,000 years ago, when he was a child, knew Anthony. He knew him. He spoke with him. He had that conversation with him. And all of us, through grace, have that ability to do that. And it's never more present than when we are at Mass. Do you know that when the church is built, and years ago, you built the foundation of the altar first, and the church was then built around the altar? Have you ever noticed that once the priest kisses the altar, we never genuflect anymore to the sacrament, the tabernacle, our Lord in the sacrament, because we are no longer there. We are at Calvary. And that altar is an altar where a victim is sacrificed, where a victim dies. And the greatness of our faith, the greatness of what Jesus did, was that he literally rises from the dead on that altar, and then we consume him. And this is something we have to constantly remind ourselves, even as priests. You know, if a priest can't celebrate Mass publicly or preach publicly, the greatest thing, the greatest element in his life is to celebrate that sacrifice, no matter where he is, to celebrate that Mass. If he still has the faculties to celebrate, he should never walk away from that, because that enables him to literally enter into the mystery. He becomes so intimately united with Christ, as all of us do, but the priest even more so, because he is alter Christus. Sinner chosen from among sinners to help sinners, but an alter Christus, which means that his hands become the hands of Christ. His voice becomes the voice of Christ. And so then when we, a faithful, receive the Eucharist, we have him physically inside of us for up to 15 minutes. In other words, I have the living, breathing body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in my entire being. His hands are physically in my hands. His heart is physically and beating in my heart. I'm looking through his eyes. That's the kind of intimacy that all of us are called to with Christ. That is the intimacy that every priest, whether he is functioning or whether he is not functioning, has as the privilege, as the gift, as the magnificent condescension of God's love to each one of us. You know, it is painful when priests are in that situation. It's terribly lonely, and they feel such fulfillment in the sacraments. But what greater fulfillment could we possibly hope for, not only as priests, but as laity, to actually consume the one we love? You know, I always like to tell people that we hug people for a reason. We hug people because if we could, we would take them inside of us. And there's a reason for that. It's because in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve walked and talked with God, God didn't have any legs. Who was walking and talking? Adam and Eve were walking and talking. So where was God? He was inside of them. And when we sinned, through that first sin, what we did was we threw God out, and there left an emptiness in there. And that emptiness was promised to be fulfilled. He would make it right. And so what does he do? He's born in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. He's laid in a manger, a place for food. At the height of his career, thousands of people walked away from him because he said one thing: unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you are dead. And he said it over and over and over, and he did not change that. Why do you think he said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood? I always wondered about that when I was a kid. Why body and blood? He said blood. Why? Because the Jews believed in the time of Jesus that the soul lived in the blood. And so therefore, for the people to understand him as saying, unless you eat me alive, he had to say, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. That's why we know that the Eucharist we receive, there is no bread there, there is no wine there. That is the living, breathing body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus himself. And That is the consolation of every priest and every Christian, that they have the one they love finally within them. And that is the great hope. That is the great gift. In fact, if we can just keep remembering that, keep drawing ourselves to that. They used to say, have a little placard in every sacristy that said, "O priest of God, celebrate this Mass as though it were your first Mass, your last Mass, your only Mass." Why? Because we have to constantly draw ourselves to the reality of the Eucharist. Because if we get caught up in music and symbolism and just that, that's important. There's no question about that. But if we leave it at that, if we put on a show or a performance, we've missed the very purpose and the very strength that we can get from that sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, we receive that sacrament. That is the living, breathing Jesus Christ. And that's why I think that as a priest, I find the greatest consolation in the holy sacrifice of the Mass and going to confession. I mean, every priest should go to confession often. It's when we don't go to confession that we think we're invincible, that we begin to think that we don't sin. Then we don't even look at the sacrament of confession as something that is that valuable to the people. If it's not valuable to me as a priest, how in heaven's name will it ever be valuable to the people? And that's why, no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, we have to keep close to the sacraments. Because if we do, it opens us up to, rather than living a human life, it opens our humanity to the level of the divine, whether you're functioning or not, whether you are preaching great sermons out in the world or you are in a little tiny apartment in the middle of nowhere where no one knows you. You have greatness within you. You have goodness within you. You have a holiness within you. And it may not be because of you, but it's because of God.
Oh, wonderful. And as we know, with Opus Bono, we have a lot of priests that are no longer serving in public ministry, but are alone. And that would be that's a great message for them.
You know, that loneliness, I think, is, to me, I found in my life that loneliness was the greatest gift that I received. I found the time to really put life in proper perspective. Because even as priests, we kind of get lost in a lot of things. We have to. We're called to be administrators. We're called to be preachers, to heal, to educate, and all the other things that are involved in being a priest. And I really thank God that we don't get married. Because when I get home at the end of the day, I really need to be alone. I really need that silence. I need to just do what I want when it comes to just, I can pray, I can eat and pray. I can do anything that I can to find myself again in my faith, in my spirituality, in that silence. Jesus was always doing that. He was always going off someplace. He was going up to the mountain. He was going to pray. And we can't forget that part of our priesthood. And I think it's one of the greatest graces that God gave us, that we do have that alone time. I treasure it. I treasure it. In fact, I'd go into a cloister in a heartbeat if that was what God wanted me to do. I tried many times. they never, it just didn't work out, I guess. They always used to tell me, you couldn't shut up for more than 10 minutes. How could you be a monk? But, I still would love to be in a monastery or in a cloister, even a hermit. That would be such a great gift. But yeah. We have to find in our silence not an enemy but a friend. We have to really begin to love it, because remember I said before, love is a choice. To love silence is a choice. We are naturally inclined to the noise. But when I preach 30-day retreats, or I give a 30-day retreat, most of the people, for the first 3 days, their ears are ringing like crazy. They think there's something wrong with them. And they always complain about it. And I said, that's because you're in silence for the first time in years. Why do you think children hear that? They have that invisible friend. They hear the voice of God. They hear the call. And then we turn up the volume. We turn up the volume. Everything's got volume. We've got earbuds in our ears. We never want to be in silence. And God doesn't raise his voice as we get older. He's not going to scream at us. He's going to whisper, just like he did when we were children. we're the ones who have to turn down the volume. We're the ones who have to find that silence and start listening again to his voice. Because he's always speaking to us. He's always, but are we listening? That's the problem. Can we hear the voice over the din, over the mad rush to sound and things? And that's why Jesus said, pull away, go off by yourself. And that's why I say that I think that's the greatest gift.
I mentioned to Father that when we're talking to priests, especially those that, unfortunately, through circumstances that either of their own fault or no fault of themselves are no longer able to confect the Eucharist in public or the sacraments, and so they're alone, and they have to live their priestly life in solitude. And often we will get calls from priests that sometimes they'll say to us, Father, that I'm in so much silence and I'm so alone, I no longer hear the voice of God. And I don't believe, and this may be a scandal to some, but it's true. At this time I don't feel God, and I'm questioning whether I even believe His existence at all.
Well, that can be a difficulty always with even a priest who's active in the ministry. We need spiritual direction. We need directors. We need priests to help other priests, or spiritual directors, especially when we're going through something like that. Why? Well, when I was in the seminary, they always said that little phrase, a self-taught man has a fool for a teacher. And that's the absolute truth. We have to have an objective view, because we're going through something, and we're the last person to tell ourselves. Even they said, teacher, heal thyself, or teach thyself, or physician, heal thyself. And what we need is someone who has an objective view to help us, to guide us. Everybody needs that. And as spiritual directors, we should be the first ones to have a spiritual director, someone that we see on a regular basis, once a month or so. And when we are down, to talk to somebody, to get it out, to speak about it, to spend some time with someone who has your best, at heart, that they're willing to do whatever they can to help you, to be there for you. Because to tell you the truth, we do need each other. And I hate to say this, but it's true, that of all the apostolates that we have, we've abandoned our priests. We've got to take care of our priests. They are still priests, whether they are functioning or not. They have the charism, they have the indelible mark of the priesthood, and they need a spirituality. And it doesn't come out of the air. Sometimes we can sit and we can listen and listen. Look at St. Teresa of Avila. She was dry as a bone for 10, 12 years? But we need, how did she get through that? She got through it because she had a spiritual director. She had John of the Cross, who she would speak to, they would talk to each other. They would inspire each other, inflame each other to that kind of love. We need to go outside of ourselves sometimes, especially priests. I don't want to see ever a priest alone that way, where he doesn't have a spiritual director. And I think any priest worth his salt who's in the active ministry would be more than happy to at least speak to a priest who may not be able to function, or who's having a difficulty or going through that dryness. Because what greater thing to do than to bring the soul of a priest to God, to the closeness of God. We all need that. There's not one of us who hasn't suffered it. So why shouldn't we be there for them? And the fact that maybe they don't think of it, maybe they don't think they could go to a priest, or maybe the priest that they know maybe don't have the time, supposedly. But I know that there are priests out there that are more than willing to help them. And they do need help, because they do have the right to a spirituality as a priest. Everybody does something stupid every now and then, or makes mistakes. And that should not eliminate them from loving God, falling in love with Him. If God forgives and forgets, that's the way we should treat those who have fallen. That's why priests, after they hear sins in the confessional, they don't remember it. I don't remember anything. I don't think I've ever remembered anything that I've heard in confession. And why? Because when God forgives, He forgets. And we still have the obligation to fall in love with God. We still have that beauty within us, even if other people don't see it, even if we're unable to manifest it to others. And so I really want priests to come, to talk, to meet with another priest and realize that you have a right to a spirituality. You have a right to be tended to, as every Catholic, every Christian has a right to be shepherded. And we as priests who are in the active ministry also have that right to be shepherded by a priest, by a shepherd. It's never just going to be what we hear on our own. It's never going to be just being alone in a room and praying. Of course, many times it may be years you don't hear the voice. And of course you begin to question everything. But if you really want to be healed, you have to seek a physician. And it may not, the priest that you talk to may not be the best in giving counseling and guidance, but at least he's there. At least there's something. And I would say even those who have been abused, laity as well as priests who have been abused, come and talk. Come and find your way through another pair of eyes. Find your way through listening. Maybe that guy will say just something that'll hit you right. Maybe it'll lift you up. Maybe give you a little bit more hope, a little bit more peace. Maybe you'll understand a little bit more the great dignity there is just in being a Catholic, in being a Christian, in being a priest, in being ordained. We should be very wary of thinking that our fulfillment is in what we do, because it really isn't. It's in who we are, and we are Christ. And if we can be more Jesus no matter where we are, I think that's where we find our great peace and our great strength from. If we look at what we do, I know it's a tough thing not to be able to do those wonderful things that we do as a priest, but we have to understand that it is in the gift that we've been given that we find our great solace and our great peace, and even the ability to forgive ourselves.
Wow. You know, this reminds me of I'm trying to remember the book. I think it was called Fishes and Loaves. It was the cardinal from Vietnam. I think it was Cardinal Van Thuan was his name. He's passed away now. And in the book, he talked about when he was imprisoned by the communists in Vietnam. And, you know, he couldn't pray, he could barely eat. And he was lamenting one day in his prayer to God that, look, Lord, here I am. I'm ordained a priest, made a bishop. I'm a cardinal, and I can't do any of the work that you've called me to do. And he said, a voice clearly came to him at that moment and said, it's not the work you're supposed to be following. It's me you're supposed to be following.
Exactly. And he had it right on, because if we, there was a heresy of doing things. The more you do, the holier you are, the better you are, the greater you are in the eyes of God. But there's one thing you will never find as a title for Jesus. Jesus most successful. You just won't. You won't. Why is it? I mean, was he, humanly speaking, was he a success? Not very much so, humanly speaking. I mean, before he died, every guy he handpicked ran away. I mean, he was batting zero.
That's right.
And so he wanted to show us that it's not in what you do. Your value is not in accomplishing things. It doesn't matter if you win or lose. It doesn't matter if you succeed or fail. It's in the love with which you do it. Teresa of Lisieux said something that really impressed me when I was in the seminary. And she said this: if I, in my clumsiness, drop a pin, but pick it up for the love of God, I can save a soul. How much more a priest? How much more a priest? Why can't a priest realize, who may not be able to function out in the world, why can't he realize that the power that he has to win souls for Christ? I don't care what he's done in the past. If he has been forgiven, and if he moves his mind and his heart to God, God will forgive. And when he forgives, he forgets. And there we have the power, through grace, through love, to really bring souls to God. It doesn't mean we have to be preaching from a pulpit. It doesn't mean we have to be going out and giving talks and being on television and things like that. All we have to do is start living for that kind of love and understanding that kind of love. That's what spiritual directors really should be doing, is helping us, every one of us, find that love to become what we eat. If we can become love, then we are priests. And to become Jesus is really the essence of what the cardinal was talking about. He was Christ there. That was his job, to be Jesus in that prison. It didn't matter, because all of the souls that he will save, how many souls did he till that soil of their soul by what he suffered? His sufferings had infinite value before the throne of God. We can't divorce our work from God's work. I mean, look at the Archbishop Fulton Sheen. When he first gave his first conference, and when he got back from studying in all the great universities, and he thought he was really smart, and he gave a parish mission, I think, at the cathedral in New York. And this woman came up to him, and she said afterward, she says, "Father Sheen, what you said changed my life. I will never be the same again as long as I live. I tell you, you've changed my life." And he, thinking, oh, I wonder what exactly did I say? He tells her, what did I say that moved you to this great conversion of soul? And she says, well, and she looked kind of puzzled, and she looked at Sheen, and she says, well, Father, to tell you the truth, I didn't understand a word you said, but I figured if I don't understand it, it must be beautiful. So, and he looked at that, and he said, thank God for that woman, because she taught me that it's not the beauty of what you're saying, it's the grace of God in somebody. And he had to get real, finally. And I think that we sometimes think that our eloquence is going to save souls, and it really isn't. It's the grace of God. When they spoke in tongues, it was in the hearing that the grace was given. They weren't speaking and babbling away. They were speaking their own language, and everybody heard them in their language. So where was the grace? Was it coming out of their mouths? No, it was in the heart of the people who were hearing them. And so, really, we shouldn't look so much at the accomplishments or what we're doing at any given moment, but really how we are doing it. I mean, we really have to recognize the power a priest has in just living day by day, and by making himself breakfast, by eating, by walking, by praising God in the surroundings, by his prayer life, by being the example, even without words. That's what Frank said. St. Francis, he said, preach always, but only when absolutely necessary, use words. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes we can't use words. So what do? We become Christ. We become the priest. We don't have to tell people. You take a collar off a priest, and if he's a priest, people know it right off the bat. They'll know it. They'll know it instantly. They'll say, are you a priest? I mean, they do it all the time. I've talked to so many priests who will take their collar off, they're going someplace, and just by how they comport themselves, just by their kindness, by their patience, by their humility, by how they do things, people look at them out of the blue. They're not even Catholic. And they'll say, excuse me, but are you a priest, perchance? They say, well, yeah. How did you know? Something about you, And I think that that's what we have to understand, that spirituality is who we really are. It's never going to be what you do. It's who you are. Then what you do becomes powerful. But you have to become first.
Wow. That's beautiful. I mean, obviously I'm relating it to the many priests that I talk to that are no longer in public ministry. I also recall a Jesuit who was working in China that I was fortunate enough to meet, but I could not talk to because he could no longer speak. He was in a wheelchair, and he was pretty much dilapidated, and he died not long after. He was a very old gentleman, but he had been buried alive in China. And they had given him a tube to breathe.
Oh, gosh.
And, yeah, that was their torture. Well, when they finally saved him, obviously he was too sick, and that's how he ended up in the condition he was in. But I remember asking another Jesuit at the time, this is when I was living in California, about him. And I said, well, what did he do, when he was down there? And the priest told the other priest, breathe.
Yeah, just what he had to do already. It was all giving glory to God.
All he could do was
Yeah.
breathe.
Exactly.
And so many times now, when priests will tell me, Joe, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. I can't take this anymore. I had a priest tell me I'm going to walk out into the ocean and I'm just going to drown myself, literally. And so many times I've said to them, just breathe, Father. Just concentrate on breathing. Don't worry about anything else. Just breathe.
Do what you do. Do what you have to do. In that, you'll find that peace eventually. But as I said before, we really need spiritual direction. Priests who are alone, all of us priests, whether they're in active ministry or and no longer practicing or in active ministry or even retired, they need to find that direction because that will help them. That really does.
Yeah, our co-founder, obviously, Father Perome, at Assumption Grotto, we just had this conversation about a month ago that a big concern for us at Opus Bono is to make sure that these priests have some kind of spirituality and some kind of friendship with another priest, which will lead to, naturally, spiritual direction, which is very, very important.
Absolutely.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left, only.
Oh.
But before we go, of course, I want to thank you for coming, Father. I've been looking forward to this, and our patroness of Opus Bono is Mother Teresa.
Ah, great gal.
You have a special relationship with her.
Yes, I did. And it's more of a spiritual relationship because every one of the missionaries of charity, when the Pope ordains someone in Rome, they are given, even without their knowledge, attached to one of their sisters. And the nun, the sister, and the priest share in each other's good works, their prayers, their spirituality, and things like that. Not even having contact with each other.
Wow.
And I was driving Mother around Rome and as a student, and it was just before my ordination. And I had just discovered that I would get a missionary of charity because I was going to be ordained by the Pope. And so I said, Mother, I said, is that true that I'm going to receive a missionary of charity? She said, yes, that's very true. And I says, well, Mother, who's your priest? And she looked at me and she said, well, I don't have one. And I said, well, Mother, don't you think that being the superior of a worldwide community where all of them have a priest, of all of them, you of course should have a priest, and wouldn't that be right? How about me? And she looked at me and she said, I would have to ask the Holy Father. And I said, okay. And I just left it at that because I thought, good heavens, I really stepped out of bounds here, I was only driving her, And, but a couple weeks later, shortly after my ordination, I got a call, and it was Mother, and all she said was, the Holy Father said yes, goodbye. And she hung up, and I thought, said Holy Father said yes, what in heaven's name could she mean? And then it hit me, all of a sudden, after about a minute, it hit me that, wait a second, the last thing I asked her was if she would be my spiritual, and she said, I'd have to ask the Holy Father. And so from that time on, I always thought, well, then I kept it to myself. Well, I was preaching to the sisters in Memphis and giving them a theological retreat, Easter. And they just asked me, and I said, I just mentioned that story, and they said, you're the one. And so now I have to go and give my name over.
Wonderful. Father, we only have about 20 seconds. I want to thank the listening audience. Thank you for being here. Could you give us all a blessing, please?
Through the intercession of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, by the passion, death, and resurrection of our beloved Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, may God send his angels to guard you, guide you, and protect you, and may the love that he has instilled within your heart grow each and every day until it consumes you into eternity, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.